Welcome to the final part of my series on the communist, socialist, Marxist dog whistle. If you've not listened to the previous parts, I hope you'll go back and listen to them as soon as possible. Today we're going to dig in to the history of our usage of this dog whistle, and as before, my hope is to persuade you that this is a dog whistle that we ought not use. It's immoral to the extent that it subverts our American values and weakens our civic republic. Let's get started. Our story begins over 150 years ago when Lincoln's Republican radical reformers, as they were called, began working hard to expand citizenship rights for Anglo females and non-Anglo males. They focused on basic liberties such as voting and property ownership and the right to work and marry across cultural boundaries. This effort involved not only former enslaved males and white females, but also Tejanos in Texas, Californios and Asians in California and throughout the West where the railroad had been built. This effort involved not only basic liberties, but also the funding for the infrastructure that is necessary for us all to enjoy them. The priorities were schools, roads, and hospitals accessible not only to Anglos, but also to non-Anglos. From sea to sea, wealthy Anglo males fiercely opposed these reforms, especially those expanding the vote to females and non-Anglo males. They reasoned that doing so would dilute their cultural dominance and result in higher taxes that would be necessary to build out what those people would vote for, infrastructural improvements to make the lives of the poor better. They objected for two reasons. First, they said it would be unfair. They owned most of the property in the United States and therefore would pay a disproportionate share of the taxes. They also objected that it would be wealth redistribution, with funds being taken from them in the form of taxes that would primarily benefit the poor and the middle class. So they fiercely opposed passage and later on the enforcement of the 15th Amendment, which interestingly didn't include voting rights for Anglo females, nor for Tejano, Californio, or Asian male residents, but only for formerly enslaved males. After the 15th Amendment passed, they shifted in their strategy, seeking to suppress not only the ability to vote, but also opportunities for wealth creation. And they did this through state and local laws mostly that were passed in the South, the North, and the West, affecting not only the former enslaved, but also the El Norte people, the Tejanos and Californios, and the Asians who had helped construct the society that we now call the West Coast. All of this was done for one reason: to sustain the cultural dominance of white Anglo males. These laws were successful. They established effective, unequal treatment under the law for 70 to 100 years, depending upon which class we're talking about. Women, as you know, were allowed finally to vote in 1920. Chinese and other Asians were finally allowed to become citizens at the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1943. We finally empowered all those who were affected by Jim Crow laws and the like throughout the United States through the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, 100 years after the end of the Civil War. Hopefully you're already familiar with much of the history I just recounted, but the key point I want to draw your attention to is the strategy that enabled this tragedy to happen. The propaganda that was so effective that made it possible for a minority to control our nation's destiny for such a long period. I say minority because the majority of Anglo males who were able to vote were not wealthy, but poor. And they had the most in common from an economics and political perspective with the non-Anglos who were also poor. These infrastructural improvements that were the policy proposals that were unable to be passed would have benefited them as well. in order to achieve democratic control, it was necessary for wealthy Anglo males to split them from non-Anglos. And so they did this with a marvelous propaganda tool that is known as, today, the communism, socialism, Marxism dog whistle. So that's what I want to tell you about now. Our story begins not in the United States, but in Paris, France. France in 1871 had lost a humiliating war called the Franco-Prussian War with the rising nation state under Bismarck that became known as the German Empire to us ultimately. Conditions in France were horrible, and a group of socialist intellectuals were successful in creating a commune known as the Paris Commune, and they took over Paris, took over political control of Paris in a violent uprising that lasted only a couple of months. But it became famous because in the midst of war, France lost control of Paris to this group in the Paris Commune who were known as the Communards. During our antebellum period, enslavers had a visceral fear of a potential uprising of the enslaved that would result in violence and massacre of the white population. And they used this, fanning the flames of this, often to maintain control over the population. When the news of the Paris Commune crossed the Atlantic, it offered an opportunity to wealthy Anglos to seize upon that visceral fear of an uprising that would result in violent overthrow of the Anglo population. And they used this to divide non-Anglos from the poor Anglo males who they needed to be a part of their voting bloc. They named the supporters for women's voting rights and for voting rights for the former enslaved Communards. Communards. America's form of the Communards, they called them. And shortly it became communists. And so the word communist began in the United States not as having anything to do with the later Russian Revolution, but for this fear of a violent overthrow of our country on a racialized basis that would happen if we empowered the former enslaved to vote and to create wealth in the way that Anglos had. The deployment of the Communard label, the first instance of our communist, socialist, and Marxist dog whistle, justified passage of Jim Crow laws in all of the states of the Confederacy and similar laws throughout the North and Midwest. And later they justified the exclusion, the political exclusion of those Anglos who supported easing of those laws, entrenching them, as I said, for 70 to 100 years throughout our land. All you had to do was call someone a communist, and they were othered. They were those who were not to be trusted. They were public enemy number one, who conspired with those who threatened the American way. One enduring impact of this era is that it ingrained in American culture this idea that sustaining male Anglo control of our culture is necessary to protect the American way. Labeling black and women suffragists as communards turned into a highly effective political strategy. It encoded a not so subtle political message that resonates even today. It encoded a political message that always conveys the same message. Anyone labeled as a communist, Marxist, or socialist is a threat to the American way, whom all good citizens are called to resist. If not, a violent takeover will occur. We are all to rally to protect our country, or else violent socialists will take over. That's the message encoded in the communist, socialist, Marxist dog whistle. And that's how describing someone as a communist, socialist, Marxist, whether true or untrue, became a standard dirty trick in our politics, a way to redefine one's political opponent as public enemy number one, whether or not it was warranted. Dog whistles only work if we, like dogs, respond in a Pavlovian way. But we are not dogs and can choose to use our critical thinking to recognize and reject dog whistles when sounded. In our history, this dog whistle is the standard way politicians have resisted reforms aimed at improving the lot of the poor and the disenfranchised. The communist, socialist, Marxist dog whistle is our standard way of resisting reforms that would dilute Anglo voting power or provide the infrastructure, insulation, and insurance that protects the poor from domination by the wealthy. Let's be clear, allowing every citizen to execute their right to vote neither abolishes private property nor establishes governmental control over the means of production. Nor do policies aimed at ensuring all citizens are free from domination due to insufficient infrastructure, insurance, and insulation. On the contrary, they strengthen our civic republicanism by widening the number of citizens participating in its responsibilities and its fruits. The communism, socialism, Marxist dog whistle always was and is nonsense, but it's highly effective nonsense. As I've already explained, it's how wealthy Anglos resisted Reconstruction and rolled it back and imposed in its stead Jim Crow laws that lasted for 100 years. It's how we resisted the demands of the labor movement before and after World War I, after World War II, and throughout most of my life. And of course, demonizing civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King as communist was our number one way of discrediting them and resisting civil rights reforms they called for during the 1950s and 60s. Let's do a thought experiment. Suppose you're a politician whose patrons want you to resist the right of women to vote. How do you do it? You sound the communism, socialism, Marxist dog whistle. How do you resist the rights of the former enslaved to vote? You sound the communism, socialism, Marxist dog whistle. How do you resist efforts of wage earners to unionize so that they can resist the dominative power of factory owners? Sound the communism, socialism, Marxism dog whistle. How do you resist building equal quality schools, roads, and hospitals for low-income people? You sound the communism, socialism, Marxism dog whistle. How do you resist efforts to outlaw discrimination based on race and gender in the workplace? It's easy. Sound the communism, Marxism, socialism dog whistle. How do you resist efforts to regulate toxic pollution practices that disproportionately affect people with low incomes? You got this. Sound the communism, socialism, Marxist dog whistle. How do you resist efforts to eliminate the structures of domination so that all citizens can look each other eye to eye as equals in the 21st century? You know the refrain. Sound the communism, socialism, Marxism dog whistle. In order for all citizens to be truly free, we must ensure two things. First, that all citizens are able to execute their right to vote. Second, we must be expressively egalitarian, ensuring that all of our citizens have sufficient infrastructure, insurance, and insulation so that they may be truly free from domination by the government or any others. Friends, that's not Karl Marx. That's actually Aristotle and James Madison, both describing what is essential for any civic republic to flourish. Suppose we're actually serious about preserving our civic republic onto the fourth generation, and not just our fourth generation, but the fourth generation of every American citizen. That is, after all, the premise that drives us to create this civic republic in the first place. In that case, we need to stop responding and repeating dog whistles, and especially this one that has caused so much evil in our history, and start responding responsibly to our charge to make all citizens free in the most robust sense. Let's do that together. Godspeed.